Hi, Dean. Welcome to BearTech. We're excited to talk about how CIOs can lead organizational change amid technology disruptions. But before we get into that, how about a quick introduction of yourself and what you do for our audience?
Sure. Thanks, Anna, for having me on the show. I am the CIO and Chief Information Security Officer for CDK Global. Many listeners may not be familiar with CDK Global, but we are a software as a service company servicing the automotive retail, truck, heavy equipment, recreational vehicle industries in their dealerships. So we have about 30,000 dealerships globally that we support in a software as a service configuration known typically in the industry as a dealer management software. So think of it as an ERP system for dealerships around the world.
Right. Okay. In less than 30 seconds or so, how would you describe the current business climate?
It's uneven. Many industries are obviously impacted in greater ways with the pandemic, like airlines, hotels, service industries. In the automotive industry, what we've seen is initially some impacts, but we've seen buyers coming now into the marketplace that were typically using Uber or Lyft. So we've seen actually quite an uptick in car sales, and car prices have stabilized quite a bit, and that has improved the profit profile. Sorry, Anna?
Yeah, was that a surprise? Keeping in mind like the current business scenario, right? With the recession going on, you have the pandemic. Was that a bit of a surprise that car sales were going up and you see new buyers coming in?
Yes, it was. I mean, I don't think anybody could anticipate exactly all of the effects of the pandemic, but even urbanization, people, leaving cities a little bit because of the concern of being in higher density environments, living environments, has had a effect on home buying, of course, but also on car buying.
Right. So Dan, let's talk about your expertise now. Where exactly does the role of a CIO come into play?
Well, at CDK, the role of the CIO is very closely aligned with the Chief Technology Officer. So we share responsibilities for the technical community in the company. I tend to focus on the security side of the house, the non-functional feature side of the house. So think of the infrastructure, the network, and then of course the internal IT systems. Whereas the CTO focuses a lot on software features, that are specific in software delivery for the customer side of our business. So I've got the platform side and the network and infrastructure side, and he has the software side of the house. So it's a bit of a different role when you're in a technology company. The CIO roles often will be much closer to the commercial side of the business than perhaps in some other types of industries.
Yeah. And how do you think the role of a CIO has evolved over the years?
Well, I think every business now is a digital business, right? And some are operating more aggressively as digital businesses, and others are, less aggressive. So, just a friend of mine who works at a steel company, just as a real continuum of contrast here, he's now involved in commercial businesses, greenhouse building, and other things that are used, because of structural steel, and they're building applications and building things that their dealers can use, to sell greenhouses for consumers and for nurseries and other things. So I think all of us are much, much more engaged in not supporting the business, but actually driving the business, which is really exciting.
And can we say that CIOs are agents of digital transformation?
Absolutely, and I think again, there's a continuum of digital transformation, right? Some new businesses are being formed, new operating models, new ways of performing customer service, and I think all of that is orchestrated and typically led in some way by the CIO. And so I think it's a very exciting time for people to be in this industry, to be in, I'll call it digital leadership roles, right? Not just the CIO, but CTOs, chief digital officers, chief information security officers. There's never been a time in my history of working in the IT industry where it's been more exciting, and we've been in a much more prominent role in recent years.
And you mentioned that at CDK specifically, the work of a CIO is, very close related to that of a CTO. And generally, how do you think, in what manners do they work with the CEO, the CTO to drive digital growth?
Well, it's a partnership for sure. And, I think one of the things when you're inside of a software company and you're working with a lot of software engineers and other, digital engineers, let's just say, kind of digital craftsmen, you get a lot of, opportunity to learn and drive things quickly. Speed, time to value is obviously a big premium in a company because, software industries tend to be highly competitive, ours included. And so you've always got to try to keep things moving quickly on behalf of your customers and maintain your competitive, feature set, which again
Right.
can be non-functional and functional. So it's very, very important to stay closely aligned with the other digital leaders, and especially in a software company, the CTO is one of those key people.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And with the dispersed supply chains in lieu of the pandemic, what challenges are being faced with CIOs today, and what are the effective response strategies to go about it?
Well, we weren't sure we were going to be able to get computers, for instance, right? And we had long lead times on things like, we were looking at upgrading our firewall technology. And so, because, initially China was hit with the pandemic, and a lot of, manufacturing of things like firewalls and computers occurs, design and manufacturing occurs in China. So we saw early on our vendors, our suppliers warning us that there was going to be longer lead times. So we started to stock up, started to move things a little bit faster, knowing that, and I'm glad we did. So, just things where, think about how many schools and others started to buy computing devices, the personal computer and, kind of Apple and Dell and Lenovo and others, they've had unprecedented sales during this time. So they've been one of the winners in the pandemic, so to speak, because of all the remote work and the homeschooling and other things that are going on. So we had to we had to be, vigilant in that supply chain against all of the other demand that was going on.
So, Dean, do you think this was a sort of like a personal challenge for you as well? I mean, getting things done at the same pace that, you guys were used to doing before the pandemic hit?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things I think CIOs and digital leaders do very well is they're used to being very adaptable to change and not being put off or paralyzed by change. And certainly the pandemic was a challenge of unprecedented size. We had call centers and other types of functions within our organization that had never been remote. Fortunately for us, we had a lot of things that we did do remote, right? Salespeople and many other types of people had remote access to systems and capabilities. But our call centers in particular and our customer support centers were largely in-office workers. So we had to really mobilize them and make sure we had the right bandwidth capabilities, and we make sure we had the capacity to handle a remote workforce, especially in our customer service centers.
Right. And is the modern CIO uniquely positioned to naturally progress to the role of a CEO?
I do think in certain industries, yes. I think in software industries or technology industries, it would be quite natural. I also think that CIOs can progress into chief operating officers because they are so intricately involved in the business processes and the operating processes of the business. So I've seen some of my colleagues move from CIO to COO and CIO to CEO. So I do think there is a greater trend there. I also think boards of directors, public boards of directors are interested in CIOs and CISOs being part of the membership of their organizations as well.
Okay. And what technological constraints do companies need to bear in mind going forward?
Wow, I think when I hear this question from you, Amna, I think of the innovator's dilemma, right? A famous book by Clayton Christensen, and people, no leader in any industry can kind of remain firmly planted. They have to keep moving forward. So I think sometimes we focus on the technical constraints, but I think often it's the people constraints. People are very habitual, right? And it's hard to change their habits. And I think there's a whole, kind of learning that CIOs are going through right now about, when they drive transformational change and when they drive change at scale, how many people have to change. And so we're becoming quick studies on the psychological impacts of change and how to change habits. And I think there's a whole science there that if you're, as a CIO, you have to appreciate, understand, and learn, and help drive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the core skills that a CIO must have, right?
Absolutely.
So, lastly, Dean, we're nearing the end of the podcast itself. But the last question is that to what extent do you think the pandemic has demonstrated the true potential of a CIO to drive organizational change?
Well, there's nothing like a really specific and difficult crisis, albeit one that's very unfortunate, in this pandemic, to drive people and align people quickly. So I think really what CIOs have the opportunity to do, and this pandemic has proven, is to maybe create a greater sense of urgency that drives alignment in their organizations. I think everybody was willing to experiment. Everybody was willing to experiment and fail, which is not common in most organizations. Even though we talk a lot about, everybody willingness to fail, there's still quite a bit of an attitude about failure in most organizations. And, people don't have permission to fail because they're using company resources, investment capital to drive things. And that's typically, a value prop for the CIO is success versus failure. So I think this pandemic has created an environment that's allowed us to experiment more, to fail a little bit, to have maybe a little bit more grace when we do fail, knowing that there was just an extraordinary task in front of us to get our businesses to operate in this new normal that we face with the pandemic.
And then you never know, right, what good can come out of a failure as well.
That's right. You're right. And I think, if you're truly a learning organization, and I did an article recently in the National CIO Review on this, if you're truly a learning organization, you are focused on, what you learn from failure and trying to play that forward. So, you layer the learnings of each effort and you try to use the good things that occurred. And that makes people feel good too, right? When they're supported and they know that something that they've done has been, truly valued, even if it wasn't commercially successful.
Absolutely. So thank you, Dean. That brings us to an end of this episode. Thanks so much for taking out the time for this.
Thank you for having me on.